personnel to civilians. At the beginning of the 20th century, for example, about 90% of the victims were soldiers, but by the 1990s, nearly 90% of the casualties resulting from armed conflicts were civilians. The Office of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees reported in 1997 that it was responsible for the welfare of some 22 million people around the world. Of those, around 13 million people were refugees in the conventional sense of the word, people who have been uprooted by war, violence, and violation of human rights throughout the world. Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for about 35% or 7.8% million of the world's refugees and displaced persons. Finally, civil wars are not only costly for the countries in which they are fought, but also for the entire regional security complex. Neighboring countries must accommodate large numbers of refugees. Moreover, civil war leads to growing defense budgets in neighboring countries, spreading disease, drug production, and trafficking, terrorism, as well as tarnishing the reputation of the region in the minds of potential investors. Let us look to the costs of conflict more closely in Mozambique. Politically, my motherland, Mozambique, gained its independence from Portugal in 1997. From the 1980s onwards, the country faced a protracted period of economic crisis, political and military instability, and a war that ended in 1992, when a peace agreement between the government and Renamo was signed in Rome. At the end of hostilities in Mozambique, between the Mozambique government and Renamo in 1992, 1 million people had died. About 1.7 million had become refugees in neighboring countries, and some 4 million had been internally displaced. At the end of the war in 1992, Mozambique was classified as the poorest country in the world. An analysis of the Mozambican conflict reveals that its underlying causes have been the subject of controversy and have tended crudely to polarize around two opposition ideological positions. The first is that the war in Mozambique was an externally sponsored project of destabilization against the Frelimo government in the context of the South African apartheid regime's total strategy for the region and the conservative Western concern about a communist-inspired government providing an alternative development model for other African states. In this grand view, Renamo was seen as a puppet force set up and sustained by external support, with no real political program or intent to govern and no domestic power base. The opposing view is that the causes of the war were mainly internal, a product of Frelimo's failed socialist experiment, ethnicity Class and regional bias is held by some to have played a major part in the conflict, given the dominance of particular groups in the respective leaderships, with Renamo associated with the Ndau or Central Mozambique and the leadership of Frelimo dominated by southern-based intellectuals. Ladies and gentlemen, a close and truthful analysis of facts easily demonstrates the absurdity of these assumptions. It suffices to say that an experiment failure in governance could not have been detected in less than 7 months. Moreover, it is demonstrable that during the first years of independence, there were many sound positive changes in Mozambique, which could have been better if there was no war. So I will not deal with all the other aspects, and this is not the purpose of this paper. But that controversy is there, and it requires a lot of explanation. A lot of facts are distorted in Mozambique and also in Zimbabwe. So we have to explain this, not only to the foreigners, we have to explain this to our own citizens. I wish now to turn to the harsh consequences of the war. The war in Mozambique had and continues to have enormous human, social, and economic impact in terms of the death, disability, displacement, and trauma suffered by the population. In addition, the war destroyed the social fabric and economic infrastructure, including health posts, trading posts, schools, colleges, factories, roads, bridges, railways, and energy facilities. Most of the economic and social gains of the late 1970s were lost. Because you must have in mind that the war was launched in February 1976. And at that time, we were just starting to rule the country. And we were doing very well. So, up to in the 70s, I may say even up to 1982, the economy of Mozambique, in spite of the war, was going very well. Communist or not communist, but it was going very well. UNICEF estimated that Mozambique's GDP in 1989 was only half of what it would have been without the war. This was a brutal war in remote rural areas, and ironically, it was the poorest Mozambicans who paid the highest price. With the end of the war, landmines continued to be a problem, causing ongoing casualties and disability, and preventing the use of some water points and agricultural lands. At the end of hostilities in Mozambique, between the Mozambique government and Renamo in 1992, 1 million people, I am repeating myself, 1 million people had died. 1.5 of 2 million or 2 million had become refugees in neighboring countries. Another 4 million were internally displaced. A further 1 million or so hovered around their homes, barely scratching out a living in highly insecure conditions, often cultivating clandestinely by day and hiding by night. In addition, around 100,000 were mobilized in the armed forces, and thousands of men, women, and children were recruited or forced into pottering production or the provision of sexual or other services for combatants. At the end of the war in 1992, Mozambique was classified as the poorest country in the world because health and education were the main cause of Frelimo's popularity. Schools and health facilities were particular targets. Students, teachers, and nurses were kidnapped and raped. Many of them had their hands, noses, lips, or ears cut off or were killed. They would say, oh, you are talking too much about Frelimo, so you have to lose your lips. You are listening too much to what Samora Machel is saying. Your ears must go. You are smelling too much. When we come, your nose must go. And this was among the teachers, nurses, and some students. During assaults to loot medicaments and other products in hospitals, patients were massacred. And assaults to hospitals were aiming at scaring people away from provision of or usage of social services. An estimated 58% of the existing 5,886 primary schools in Mozambique were destroyed or forced to close during the war. 3,000 rural shops were destroyed or closed. Many livestock were lost or stolen. Food stores and houses burned, looted or destroyed, and other household items such as clothing were stolen. The cumulative losses in output in the period of 1982-1992 has been estimated to be between 15 billion United States dollars and 20 billion United States dollars. This does not include the losses from February 1976, when the war started, until 1982. So the figures 15 million to 20,000, 15 billion